Hello, world. I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Barnes & Noble's podcast, Poured Over, and I'm just waiting for Kevin to pop back onto the screen. We were hanging out a minute before. Hi, Kevin. How are you, pal?
Hey, good to see
Good to
you.
see you again. So welcome to the world, everyone. We're so excited to have Kevin Wilson here. Obviously, you know him as the author of The Family Fang and Nothing to See Here. And of course, Now is Not the Time to Panic, which is now out in paperback. It's a monthly pick from Barnes & Noble. And Kevin, it is so good to see you, pal.
Oh, it's great to see you too.
How are things? You good?
Yeah, I'm great. I got a
Excellent,
tattoo
excellent.
yesterday and ready to go.
Wait, did you just say you had another tattoo yesterday?
Yeah, I came up to Chattanooga to get a tattoo from a friend of mine and then do this event. So it's a good one-two punch.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, if every author got a new tattoo every time they did an event, okay. I'm going to stop doing that. All right. So here's the thing. If you registered over Eventbrite and dropped us a question, I have those questions. If you want to drop questions for Kevin in the chat and in the Q&A module as we go, I'm happy to work them into our conversation. So feel free. Oh, Denise Neary is asking what the tattoo is. Do you feel like talking about that?
It's just two little kids holding
Oh,
cards up over their face. It's very. I have put no thought into my tattoos ever.
it sounds like a very you tattoo, though.
It is. I like little weird kids is my thing. So yeah,
Well, speaking of little weird kids, we are
yeah.
here to talk about Now is Not the Time to Panic. And I do happen to love, as you know, these weird kids.
No,
I do.
thanks.
I like Frankie and Zeke quite a lot. And I'm still very charmed by the fact that you opened this book with a greased watermelon. As a child who was
Yeah.
tortured, no, seriously, as a child who was tortured over summers in New England when, watermelons would be thrown off of docks and the children would be just sent to go chase after it. Boy, it was very funny to see that in a public pool. So, can we talk about the start of this book for you? How did we get these kids?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that. I mean, Miwa, like you've always been so kind to me and such a great reader and thoughtful person when we talk about the work. But like for me, I feel like every book I write is just so much of it is just what I'm interested in is how do we make something, and then what's our responsibility to the thing that we make, you
Yep.
know? And so sometimes it's art.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's family and kids, but I write that over and over. So I'm just always interested in like, what does it mean when, with your own two hands, you bring this thing into the world? And then what happens once it's out of your grasp?
Mhm.
And so for me, with this book, I knew that's my theme I return to, but I've had this phrase in my head that's the phrase in the poster.
Yep.
And the edge is a shanty town filled with gold seekers. We are fugitives, and the law is skinny with hunger for us. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And it's finally, I was like, I'm going to write a whole book about this one phrase, but you can't. I don't know. Maybe you could. You can't just say that word a thousand times, that phrase a thousand times and then publish it. So I knew I needed somebody to make it and hold it and feel the reverberations of it. And I'm 45 years old. I have kids that are 15 and 10. They live in the same county where I grew up. And so I'm having those weird moments. It's almost like little like acid flashbacks where they're in the movie theater that I was in as a kid,
Right.
and I'm watching them experience the world in ways that I did but different. It's hard not to look back to the past.
Well, okay, it's hard to not look back to the past, but you did a really cool thing. And Now is Not the Time to Panic. You said it in 1996. So we're taking out the internet, we're taking out cell phones, we're bringing back serendipity and discovery in a way that we honestly, and I say this as a, listen, I say this as a person who's guilty of carrying two cell phones. Okay, I will own it. I will absolutely own it. But all of those like long summers where you're just like, oh, there is no sense of time, and you just end up out in the world for an entire day, and then you are allowed back in the house at some point. Did I just date myself terribly? I think I probably did. But I mean, those were crazy, languid, beautiful days that we kind of don't really get anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to feel nostalgic, right, for
Mhm.
anything that was your past. But
Right.
I wanted to set it in 96 in the summer before the internet when, you were experiencing basically whatever the world would give you in your limited
Yeah.
space where you were.
Hmm.
And whenever you deal with the lack, man, it's great, because when you have lack, you make weird stuff out of what's available.
Right. Right. Like if you think about it, I was actually just talking about this with a friend at dinner last night. I miss magazines. I miss paper magazines because you just had this wild range and it could be, something as big as Interview, but then like zine, remember zines? You were a zine guy, weren't you?
Yes, I
Yeah.
love
So,
things.
I mean, all of it. And it's just like you had to touch the paper and you felt like you were connecting with your own personal weirdos. And it was great. It was so much fun, except Frankie and Zeke, they're connecting with their weirdos, and then it kind of gets a little out of control and a little out of their hands. And I think it's good to remember that you could have stuff go viral before there was an internet.
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, yeah, they put up this poster and it kind of creates a bit of a panic and it goes national. Like everyone's trying to figure it out. And I think for kids like my kids and
Mhm,
also like students that I teach in
mhm.
college, I want them to understand that like virality existed before the internet. It's just that, and what I loved about it was things would get to you, but you couldn't, it's not like the three places where everything gets to you now, like Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. You had no say over when it would arrive,
Right,
right? But things
right.
did go viral, and I loved that. I loved knowing that, oh, it's coming through this kind of radio signals in weird ways.
So the art, though, you gave the kids a Xerox machine.
Yeah.
You gave them, I mean, it's kind of like the Stone Age. I mean, there is no Photoshop, there is no retouching, there is no filter. You got a couple of bored kids, an elderly Xerox machine that's probably like the size of the garage, or at least that's how I imagine it. Because remember how big they were, or like fax machines, they
Yes.
were all
Oh yeah.
ginormous. So I want to talk about these kids and the stakes, though, because you're cutting back and forth between time, right?
Yeah.
Frankie is an adult before we get to the watermelon. But I want to talk about the structure and I want to talk about how you found Frankie and Zeke and their voices.
So okay, yeah, this will be good. I think I, a lot of people have said like, is this young adult? Is this a YA
Wait,
novel?
what?
And to me,
No, have you
they
seriously
ask,
been asked that?
yeah, because it's
Oh,
about these teenage kids. And I don't have any, I mean, like, I love YA,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I think for me, like, what makes it not YA
Mhm.
is that it's an adult Frankie. Look, and that's
Yeah.
what young adult wants to read about sad adults looking back into their past. But so it's Frankie looking back at this
Mhm.
formative moment, but I don't know, like as you start to reminisce and think about the past, like your
Right.
voice goes back to the cadences of how you used to talk. Like it becomes so easy to slip into that world. And so I wanted adults who still felt like kids, because
Right.
that's honestly what I still feel like. And so I knew that was that was going to be my entryway into this story, was
Mhm.
adults looking back at when they were kids, not certain that they ever became adults. And that was going to be kind of my tilted view of how to tell this story.
Okay.
Yeah.
A very Kevin way of telling. It's a very Kevin
Yeah.
Wilson way
Always.
of telling the story. Hey, Alexa Thompson, I don't know if you're in the audience right now, but she had a question. Your stories from a woman's POV have a surprising compassion and tenderness to them that I don't find from a lot of male writing. What inspirations do you draw from to create these POVs?
Oh man, that's very thoughtful and kind, and I love that hearing that. I also have, I have lots of people reviews that are like, you can tell a dude wrote this, and that's valid too. Like I can't control how someone
Right,
responds to what I put on the page,
right.
but I mean, for me, I mean, I think it's a couple things. One is just spending my young life around women and being kind of cognizant and aware
Right,
of the way in which how they move through the world was different than how I moved through the world, and that
right.
was fascinating to me. But also just personally, there's something that's very, just because of my life and who I am. There's something that's calming within the pages of the fiction that I write to enter into this voice that's a woman's voice, but it feels very natural to me, and it's lovely to be able to utilize it on the
Mhm.
page.
Yeah.
But then the last thing is like the way that I do, I'm trying to do it is I'm writing about a very specific woman, like, and so um, I know that it's not going to resonate for every single reader. So
Right.
what I just try to do is get it as close as possible to what I think feels right and organic, so that when I slip up, because I know I am, there's going to be moments where people are like that. If I just slip up, I've built up enough generosity from the reader that they'll give me the benefit of the doubt to swing it back into the narrative. And I mean, honestly, that's just how I write, period, is I try to do it well enough that I earn the benefit of the doubt from the reader.
I also really grooved on Frankie's mom. I really liked her. Sometimes you meet parents in this book and it's very sort of footloose, you know? It's like, oh, the parents are all standing in the way of the art and the da-da-da and the freedom and everything else. And Frankie's mom is just great.
Oh,
She's such a good character. She's such sort of this, oh, I'm gonna veer into cliche for a second, but sometimes cliches are cliches for a reason. She's a real breath of fresh air as far as parents go
oh,
in a novel like this, right? And actually, Lindsay Blackburn is asking, the book has interesting characters. I particularly like the relationship between Frankie and her mom. See, I'm not the only one. Can you give us some insight into your inspiration for Frankie's mom, Zeke's parents, and the artist neighbor next door who, quote, parents Frankie in the after. We're trying to stay away from
yeah.
spoilers, so some people have,
No,
even
that's
though it's in
great.
paperback, there's a thing that happens to Frankie. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's a thing. And some neighbors come in and do some cool stuff for her, not because mom is, being a bad mom, but just neighbors.
Well, I'll just say, like, most of my previous books, like, adults are bad.
Yeah, I
Like,
know.
I write a lot about bad parents, and I think it's because, like, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to make worse parents than me so I don't feel so bad. But a lot of times I just, like, I'm suspicious of adults. I just
Mm,
am. And so when it came time to write this book, though, and I knew Frankie was really vulnerable as a teenager, but I knew
right.
also she survived, she made it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to imagine a mom, a parent who would be kind. And I was like, for the first time ever, I think I'm going to make a nice parent. And there was just something so lovely in allowing that possibility to imagine, like, even though the dad has left and even though they feel like a broken family in some ways, I wanted to write like a good relationship between a parent and a child, so that even when they look back on their life, they know that there was somebody watching them or thinking about them. And I just felt like, for the nostalgia of the story, I didn't want it to be ruined. And I had so much fun writing that mom. Maybe because I felt a little like that mom now, because I have a teenager. I was like, let's make this mom a little dope, a little cool, She's with it.
There
I was
are
trying it
actually
out.
parents who do that. Yes, there are. And there are some who are just like, and you, there will be no
Yeah.
television. We survived that too. Those of us who were not allowed to watch television as tiny people, you know, we survived. I will say that. But I want to talk about the creation of art, right? So we've established that Frankie does have this very loving, wonderful environment, but it is teeny tiny. Would you sort of walk us through the landscape of this tiny, tiny, tiny town in Tennessee where everything happens? Because that's part of how this all works. I don't think it would quite work if you had, a subway to the city three blocks.
Yeah, I mean, so even let's just forget about, like, the internet, because even
Yep.
without the internet in '96, if you
Yep.
lived in New York or Chicago or even Atlanta,
Yep.
you had a connective tissue to things. So one of the things I was just trying to think about, because I grew up in a small town very much like Coalfield, was, what does it mean when you're never getting any of the art at the time that it was meant in the linear order?
Yep.
So you never know, like, what precedes this thing that you found or what came after. All you have is the thing. And you're really, really interested in it, but you're embarrassed to talk about it because you're afraid that somebody who knows about it will say, well, that's super dumb. And actually, nobody respects that form of art or
Mhm.
that book or that movie. So you stay quiet and you love it in your small, little, limited way. And you hope that you can find more stuff like it, but you got to kind of search and you're never quite sure. And so you're always afraid that the thing that you love is something that nobody else likes or cares
Right.
about. And it feels isolating, even when art can open you up and make you love the world and make you see these possibilities. It can also make you feel so small in the world because you just don't know if there's anyone else that cares.
And the wild flip side of that, though, so I grew up in a suburb where I had access to major cities and information, and we were the kids who were pining for the thing that would keep us separate, right? Like, what was the radio station that no one was listening to yet? Like, did you find the cool store? Blah, blah. And of course, you're a teenager and you know nothing, right? Like, you think you know everything, but you know nothing. And so to have that sort of reflected back at me as I'm reading Now Is Not the Time to Panic was really kind of great because, that difference right there, right? Like I could hop on the T, like, and then it took a little work to get to the T, but like you could do it. And we were sort of allowed at a very young age to like be on the subway by ourselves and go off and do our thing. And parents would be like, okay, so here's a quarter, call us when you're ready. And I think the world is a little different now. But the idea that you had that freedom to ramble, even as a young person, and I mean, probably too young, but it's wild how you experience the world, right? And like, as you were saying, art is the thing that connects us, except when it kind of doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's it's the danger and the cost of anything that you love
Right.
that resonates, is that you hope that it's resonating beyond you. It's the danger of making it too.
It is. I mean, part of what I found really interesting about Frankie too is she kept looking to all of the people sort of around her to say, well, is it good? And everyone's like, well, it's interesting. It's this, it's that, it's radical, blah, blah. And she's like, but is it good? I mean, this is a kid who really just wants to know that she has a place in the world, right? And that people,
Yeah, yeah.
that she
I,
fits.
I, yeah, like Frankie, like she wants it to be a secret, but she also just wants to know, like, I think she says it at the very beginning. They're like, we'll just walk up to the poster around that crowd of people and be like, wow, who made this cool thing? Someone who's very cool, I bet. And that for me, like, that's what making art was at that young age. Was it was about making the thing, but it was also trying as hard as you can to say, like, my hand made that. Maybe there's something good in my hand, if I was the one. And so you desired so much somebody else just to remark, just to notice.
I remember thinking when I first read Now Is Not the Time to Panic that there was a real evolution to your work. And I love Family Fang, right? Like we both
Yeah.
know how much I love that book and the potato gun and there's stuff that happens in that book. And if people out watching this have not read the Family Fang, please just go read the Family Fang because it's wild, that book. But I do think there's sort of a softening to you. There's a little bit of a gentle reflection. I know you touched on it earlier when you're saying, well, now I'm the parent of a teenager, but I don't think that's all of it. I don't think that's all.
What do
I
you
don't
think
think
it
it's
is?
just, I don't know, but I don't think it's just you getting older or having a teenager. I think it's the way you're interacting with your own art. So can we pick this apart for a second? And maybe I'm getting us onto very thin ice. We'll find out. But the idea that you're a little looser on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you do a ton of rewriting, and I know like one of the things you love most about Nothing to See Here is that you were working in a way that allowed you to see brevity in
Yeah.
your own work, and that was sort of the big change. Do you think there was a change from that book to this that I'm maybe possibly overstating?
Do you mean from Nothing to See Here to
From
this, or
Nothing
from?
to See Here to Now Is Not the Time to Panic, or even from Family Fang to Now Is Not the Time? There just seems to be something. Those three books sort of feel like a continuum in a way that maybe the stories, I mean, I love the stories too, but yeah, there's something about those three together. So can we just look at them as a set for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I think of them as parts of a whole,
Okay.
because they're a in so many ways. Like Family Fang is like, what does it mean to be made?
Right.
And so what does it mean to be the made thing? And then Nothing to See Here is, what does it mean to protect the made thing?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think Now Is Not the Time to Panic is all of that stuff mixed together, which is like, what does it mean to be the made thing, but also to have made a thing? And what does it mean to then like go back and try to figure out the thread that connects those
Right.
two? So yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be like super like weird or like self-effacing, but like
Right.
I have a list of obsessions that I write about over and over again. I tell the story differently because I want the reader to to read all my books. But those are the things that I'm interested in. And with Now Is Not the Time to Panic, I think what you're seeing as the softening is that I'm trying a little bit harder to allow for tenderness in getting from point A to point B.
Okay.
Uh, do you know what I mean? Like, I know point A and point B are always going to be there. Like, my
Mhm.
beginning and ends are pretty much always the same. Like, you find yourself like in a you find yourself questioning like the made thing or who you are or who your family is, and by
Right.
the end you come to a reckoning. And now what I'm trying to do, and especially in Now Is Not the Time to Panic, is I'm trying to be more tender with my characters. I'm trying to convey them from point A to point B in a way that allows for a little more grace and a little
Yeah.
more possibility.
Yeah.
And I just think I had a professor a long time ago, because this was in college. He was 80. It was his last year. He was so tired of us 19-year-old creative writing students, and so many stories were ending with like characters killing themselves or like
Right.
ruination. And he was just so tired. And he just said, if you truly ask your characters what they want, they'll tell you that they want to live. And he's like, can you find a way to keep them alive? And that did not resonate with me for maybe 10 more years. And then I think about it all the time when I write
Right.
now. It's like, is there a way I can do it? And sometimes the answer is no,
Mhm.
right? But like, if I can convey these characters in some way that gives them grace, can I do it? And whenever you're doing a novel, it's a long haul. You
Mhm.
want to
Mhm.
believe that there's a possibility that you can do it.
I think it's good too to ask the question, right? Like we're so sure of ourselves when we're teenagers, right? Like we're sure of ourselves in very kind of I'm you know, if you're living with teenagers right now, congratulations. My dad used to say you can tell you're genetically programmed to love your children because that's how you survive them being teenagers. It's like, oh, okay. Well, you have a
I
point.
get it.
Um, but it's really it's so lovely to be part of that because you are still taking on the stuff that's harder and the sort of panic that comes, right? Like all of this art gets misinterpreted. People see what they want to see, and it's a little claustrophobic, right? And that's
Yeah.
not the first thing anyone might think when they pick up this book, right? But and it's partially the small town thing. It's partially the moment in our culture, right? Like we've had many of these moral panics, um, possibly seemingly more prior to this moment we're in now. But structurally, okay, we're getting from point A to point B. We've got Frankie, we've got Zeke, we've got Frankie's family, we've got the tiny town. How much of this is getting mapped out before you sit down to write, and how much of it is revealed to you as you're doing the work?
Oh, I would say almost all of it is mapped out before.
Okay.
Like, it takes me so long to sit down to write finally. I have to worry it in my head forever. And so in my head, I'm like, this is the whole thing. I can't hold it in my head any longer. It's time to write it.
Okay.
And so it's just like anything with making something. I have it pristine. I'm like, this is how it's going to work. But the moment it becomes tangible and physical, you're like, oh, that won't work.
Right.
But I'm already in it. The momentum's building. And then you got to rely on craft. You're like, I got to figure out how to make this get to here from here to here. And this way I thought it's not going to work. And that's actually some of the most thrilling stuff about making
Mm.
art, is when the art, you reach the limitations of what you can
Okay.
do versus what's
Okay.
in your head. And then you just got to work it. You got to build out whatever you have, whatever you can make to get it to work. And to me, that's the most fun. That's when your real style comes out.
And if I remember correctly, you are a sentence by sentence guy. You have a thing for sentences, right? Like everything gets built started and but are you rewriting as you're going, or are you getting a draft out and then you go back and you chip away until you get what you want?
So I loop. So my just the way my brain works is
Yep.
I write, and the minute I flag, I go back to the beginning and
Okay.
read through it and make corrections. And so I'm just looping over and over. And
Okay.
that's how I'm building up the momentum to keep going.
Got
So
it.
that's why the beginnings of my work is always much tighter for my editor than the end, because I haven't looped
Okay.
as many times with the end. They're always like, let's go back and look at the last
Okay.
third. But Man, the first third I have probably written 200, 300 times, just
Okay.
making little tiny adjustments each time I loop back.
But do you consider that 200, 300 a draft? That's just the work, right?
It's
That's
not a
not a
draft.
draft. That's just the
No,
work.
it's
That's just you doing your thing.
but the thing that I have to do always is start at the beginning
Okay.
and like catch the wave again
Okay.
and ride the momentum as far as I can before the kids are like, "Hey, we want to play basketball," and I got to set it down. So each time I go back into it, though, I have to catch that wave again, and
Okay.
that's what gives me the momentum to keep right. It's just the way I've always worked,
Yeah.
and that becomes fun because you remember the rhythm of the sentences, and instead of starting cold, I follow the whole thing through, and I'm like, now I'm in. The
Right.
voice is the voice that I need it to be.
So what happens if you don't catch the wave?
Oh, I go play basketball with my
Okay.
kids. Like I don't sweat it. Like I don't believe in a muse or anything like that. Like you
Right.
just put in the time and you make the thing, and when it doesn't, you go do something else until you figure out how to do it. So if I can't catch the wave, there is nobody around me that really cares if I make this thing or not. There's just so much laundry to fold and dogs to be walked. So like
Right.
it's easy to go step away if it's not working. And that's good for me because
Right.
I'm not gonna sit there if it's not working.
How old were you when the first story collection was published?
It was 2009, so was I 31? I think I
Okay.
was
So
31.
you had work experience that was not the writer's life before the first book came out, right? You were already teaching though, weren't you?
Yeah, I was teaching. I've never had real work experience, if I'm being honest. As a janitor,
Okay.
as a kid, as a teenager,
Right.
and then I've everything after that was secretary. I've been a secretary until I was a teacher. It's just
Okay.
it's the best thing in the world. So that's what I did.
Which is also partially because you know what I'm setting you up to talk about, right? Like that's that secretarial job, that typist job is actually partially how we got now is not the time to panic, right? Isn't that when you created that line that runs through this book, the edge is a shanty town filled with gold seekers? Isn't that weren't you
Oh,
inserting that
no,
into
it was in Family Fang.
oh, it was in Family Fang. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's in Family Fang. And
Oh,
it was
right.
in a
Butch
failed
says it,
novel
right?
before that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Butch.
it's like Buster hears it on a tape recorder, and
Okay.
I was like, "Oh, I'm done with that line, and
Yeah.
now I never have to think about it again."
Okay.
And then it's like, "No, I got to make a whole novel." But yeah, like the repetition, even in my work,
Yep.
I'm doing it constantly. I
Right.
go back into the previous book and pull something out of it to be the new book, always.
Have you thought about the next book?
Yeah, I'm writing it
Okay.
right now.
Okay. Okay.
And it's always the loop. So like if you look at Family Fang,
Yeah.
uh the woman, the sister in that, she's in a movie where the kids catch on fire and she's the governess.
Right.
And I was like, I'm gonna grab that. I gotta make that into a book. And I wrote Nothing to See Here. And then I went back for Now Is Not the Time to Panic with that line. And then in Now Is Not the Time to Panic, there's a scene where there's a moment where she writes these evil Nancy Drew novels,
Yep.
but she wrote one novel for adults that wasn't very good, where a woman goes to pick up all her half sisters to go to the funeral of her dad. And I was like, oh, that's the next book. And so I'm writing a book where I'm taking from that and trying to make it into its own thing. I need the little connective tissue, but it's gonna be its own thing.
So you have a universe then. That's what you're telling us. You have a universe that it's not just suddenly you're sitting around saying, oh, here's this great idea. It's you're sort of picking at things until
Yeah, I put them in a book and then I see if they come back to me. I'm like, oh, why
okay.
am I still thinking about that? It's a little tossed off thing. I think I'm going to work with it. And, I'm not going to have, you don't have many ideas in your life. Everybody falls off, everybody starts to lose it. So I'm going to just keep kind of seeing what's in the stuff that I've made and see if I want to come back to it. So, yeah, Coalfield is in every book. And so, yeah, it's just going to keep happening.
I am certainly not complaining. I want to step out of Tiny Coalfield for a second, though, and you've been teaching at Sewanee. And also, I mean, it's a small community, right? So a couple of different questions. What have you learned from your students is where I want to
Ah,
start. Let's start there. And then I
sure.
have a question to
Yeah.
come.
And so I teach at the University of the South. It's a
Mm-hmm.
small school on the Cumberland Plateau. It's a really lovely school. I have really lovely students. I've been teaching there since 2005. And I think the main thing that teaching does for you, or it does for me, is uh, it forces me to always interrogate what I instinctually do in
Right.
order to explain it to someone else. So, like my students, what they force me to do is every single time I have to renegotiate. Why do I do this? Or why is this story working the way that it is? And when I read their work, I have to continually like, what are you trying to do here?
Mm-hmm.
How is that working? And it's great. It keeps you sharp and on your toes because you can't just be like, fiction works like this, or this is how character works. You have to always kind of go back in and worry it and interrogate it and make sure you know that you feel confident about it. So that stuff's fun for me. And I love to, oh, YSR means yay, Swanee's right, which
Oh,
is
okay.
the little college phrase. But so yeah, and students like they don't, they're not just going to accept what you say as law.
Mhm.
You gotta show them.
Right.
So it's fun to figure out different ways to meet what they need to show them how to make what they want to make.
So, and Alex, who just dropped that comment, the YSR, I was like, I don't even know what that means. Um, Alex has a question from Eventbrite. How much does life at Sewanee influence the development of your characters? I mean,
Oh yeah, not much. I will be honest. Like, so Coalfield is based. I grew up in the same county, so I grew up.
yep.
I live on top of a mountain now. I grew up in the valley. The valley is
Right.
very different from the mountain. I grew
Mm-hmm.
up in a really rural, not like Swanee, which is a college campus. And so for me, when I write, I'm mostly thinking about the valley where I grew up,
Okay.
where there was access to very little. But I live in Swanee now, and when you live in a small town, even if you're unknown, like you may not know the person that you're walking past,
Mm-hmm.
but you have some sense of the connective tissue between you and them.
Yeah.
And it's both a good and bad thing to know that to actually be aware of the little threads that connect you to every single person in the town in which you live. It can be rewarding sometimes when you feel that community and you feel connected in these beautiful ways.
Yeah.
But for someone like me, it can also be super terrifying where you feel a little um, worried that you're gonna mess up those threads and make something explode in a way you couldn't in a big city.
Oh, you mean like Frankie and Zeke?
Yeah, that's my fear.
I
I
mean,
mean, that's they're me, and so yeah, that's my worry.
okay, Denise Neary has another question. Do you imagine revisiting any of these folks, any of these characters in future books? I mean, it seems to me like the ideas are the things that you're more in love with and that you need new people, but I'm
No, you're
still
right, Miwa. That's it. I need new
Mhm.
people, and part of
Right.
it is like it's really hard to get these. Like I've had a lot of people ask with nothing to see here, would you go back to those Fire Kids and write a sequel to it? But like, I don't ever want to put them in peril again. Like I know I would
Right.
have to like complicate the narrative in ways, and I just love leaving them in that moment of grace because there's no way it's going to be happily ever after. So for me, it's like this is where I've left them in that little moment of grace, and whatever else happens, that's theirs.
Mhm.
That's their thing. So it's hard for me to want to go back because I'd have to worry it into existence again and create a
Yeah.
new conflict.
Uh, that
And I
seems
worked so hard to get them to where I needed to get them.
yeah, that seems like a lot. That really
I don't
does.
want to talk about it like kids, but it's like kids. Like you
Right.
get them to a certain point and then
Right.
you got to hope for the best.
When you're working through all right, let's call it the problem of the novel for a second. I know you've mapped
Mhm.
everything out before you sit to write. I know you're starting and working from the exact point that you need to work from, but there are going to be moments. I mean, as you said, writing a novel is a huge commitment. There are going to be moments where you walk into a wall. Okay. You know this, I know this. You go out, you play basketball, you come back, but how much of it is, I mean, does craft save you? Is craft the thing that keeps you, like, you don't believe in serendipity, right? So how do you build the craft muscle for as long as you've been doing this?
Well, I mean, I feel lucky that I write fiction because narrative is just the way in which our brains function. Like
Yeah.
everything is based around narrative. And so, uh, so much of the world in which we live is trying to explain yourself to other people or trying to understand other people by understanding their narrative. So it's not that difficult for me and to think about it that way. But like my friend Anne, it is Ann Patchett,
Yeah, yeah.
and she all we talk about writing a lot. I mean, she's like, I just love talking about craft and stuff. And for her, and I think I learned it from her a little bit, is like whatever it is that you want to make, you got to stand on the shoulders of craft.
Yeah.
Like that, that's the way it's going to work. And so I've just always relied on that. That like even if it seems slightly out of reach, what it is I want to make,
Mm.
if I can if I can just build like characters that seem believable, right? Like if I
Mhm.
can make these characters feel understandable to the reader, and
Yeah.
if I can evoke a setting that feels like a place that people might know or can relate to, and if I can build a narrative that convincingly gets those characters through the story, then I'm set. You
Right.
know, I know then if I can keep that structural stuff working, I can make that weird, and I do a
Yeah.
lot of weird stuff. I can make that weird stuff function. You know, I can make kids burst into flames
Right.
because I've got like, you don't want those kids to get hurt,
Right.
right? It doesn't matter if they're just these little sprites who burst into flames and who cares? Like,
Mhm.
what does it matter? It's all magic. I got to do that. I have to rely on the craft to make the reader accept that weird stuff is where I'm trying to get a little further.
I mean, every isn't the creation of art, isn't just the very act of it, whether it's a book or a film or what, it's an act of faith, right? I mean, not necessarily in the universal, like there's a religion attached to it. I mean, faith in the sense that somehow it will find the person it needs to connect to, right? I'm one of those people who believes there actually is a book for every reader. And if you haven't fell in love with reading, you just haven't found the book. And I, though, as a reader, like I need voice. I need beautiful sentences. I love character, but like I don't necessarily need stuff to happen, but I have been yanked out of stories when I hit a
yeah,
clunker of a sentence and I'm just like, wait a minute, what just happened here? And
yeah.
I don't think I'm the only reader that happens to, but when do you know it's time to hand it over to your agent and your editor? When do you, because I have a sneaking suspicion you could sit there and say, well, Kraft says I need to keep going.
Mhm.
At some point, you have to hand it over.
Yeah, and it's actually not that hard to hand it over because
Okay.
like you reach a point and it's like there's a point where you're like it will never be perfect.
Yeah.
The thing that I have made will never be perfect, but I am going to work to the limits of my ability. And once I
Mhm.
hit that, like there's no point to keep going. Like I have kind of and I live so much inside my head that there is that really necessary. I mean, like God, your agent and your editor are the people that save you again and
Right.
again because they know what it is that you're trying to make because they've read your work,
Yep.
but they can see it outside of your own weird viewpoint of the book. And that's I'm always happy to give it over and be like, this is the limits of what I can see on the page. And I need somebody else just to tell me like,
Mhm.
oh, you're so far into it, you don't understand how messed up and weird these things that you think of as just normal.
Mhm.
You got to make this understandable. It's great. And I really love that moment. It's terrifying because they're always like, you did it. It just needs all this shit that you can't believe you have to go back and do. But it's helpful and
Right.
it's necessary. And like I said, I work to the limits of my ability, and I'm not going to hold on to it any longer than I have to. I'm ready at that point to figure out what does it do.
Okay. Bailey McMahon, I'm going to paraphrase some of your questions and I'm going to put them all into one. Okay. Um, so we're going to start though with obviously Anne is not your only writer friend. Um,
No.
is it hard to have friends who do what you do? Does it cloud your creativity? I'm paraphrasing Bailey. But it seems to me that sometimes it's very useful to be in community, and other times you just need to stare at a wall and do your thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I would say most of my friends are not writers. They do creative things or they have
Mhm.
obsessions that are interesting to me, and that's why
Right.
we're friends. But I will say, like, sometimes it's nice just to talk to somebody else that makes stuff in the same form that you do,
Right.
just so you can talk shop. Because
Mhm.
who in the world wants to talk about this stuff sometimes, except
Right.
people that love books? And so to talk to another writer sometimes, not just about like, hey, how are you writing, but just to talk about cool things that you like or that you've seen, and it gets you excited. So yeah, I it's just like anything, you want people to love the stuff that you love, and it can make you feel less alone in the world. So writer friends are huge, I really appreciate the friends that I have whose work I really admire,
Right.
who have seen something in my work and it's made us closer. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to go back to Swanee for a second because I know for years you would teach Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad.
Yeah.
And I love that book. I also love Candy House, which if you
Yeah.
haven't read Candy House, I'm going to say go read Candy House, y'all. Um, you don't teach your own work though, right? You
No.
that would okay, Bailey, he doesn't teach his own work, so I'm going to say we answered that.
No way. I don't think a lot of my students don't even know that I have published. So it is
Oh,
not
that's fun.
it is
Okay,
not
that's
something
really
we're gonna
funny.
talk about.
Okay.
But no, I don't. But I do teach Egan all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you love most about teaching Goon Squad?
Oh man, like where do you begin? Like it's just a perfect book.
I know.
And so formally it's super interesting because it's not linear. It's
Yep.
broken into two halves.
Yep.
Characters recur. Like everything formally and structurally about it is super interesting to take
Yep.
apart. So like for a beginning writer or an experienced writer, you can find all this cool stuff just like why is she doing what she's doing?
Mhm.
But again, it's not just academic. That is a deeply, deeply beautiful book
Right.
about time, about what does it mean for time to pass. And I just, even for my young students, it hits them differently than it hits me. But there's a moment in the book where Stephanie is saying it feels like everything is ending, and her brother says everything is ending, but not yet. And I don't know that I've ever felt that kind of gratitude in a
Mhm.
book. That moment of just
Right.
complete connection to a work of art. I just love it. I've read it more times than any other book, and every single time I find something super dope that I didn't recognize before.
See, I love that. I love the idea of being able to just fall back into some. I don't always have the luxury of rereading as much as I would like. Hence my butchering of Buster's name. Sorry, Buster.
No.
Um, let's just own it. But it's a good thing I don't have children. I would probably just call them all by the wrong names. It's terrible. But it's true. I would totally do that. But I do. uh, I love the idea that a reader brings what they're going to bring to a story, right? Like you said it at the top of the event. Like you can't, like, you put the book out into the world and people are going to do with it what they do. But I love the idea of generations of new writers and readers being brought to Egan's work in a way that they might not otherwise experience it. And, if you think about the story she wrote on Twitter that becomes part of Candy House, like possibly one of the only good things ever to come out in the history of Twitter. But that story was, and she was doing it before anyone else. So the idea that you could play with form in that way was just, I love the idea that you can slip between stories and like, is it a book and stories? Is it story? Why can't we just have a really great reading experience? Right.
Yeah, and like that black box Twitter story or Great Rock and Roll
Yeah.
Pauses, which is really one of the most emotionally affecting stories I've ever read. It's just a
Mhm.
PowerPoint presentation. But like one of the things I love about her work too is that it's
Mhm.
not super showy. It's
Yeah.
not super overly academic she's just like, I'm gonna do this form and let's see what happens when I use it.
Right.
And I think that's part of what makes it work is because there is a real story at the heart of it that the structure is making better, but the structure is not the whole reason for it existing.
Right. So that
Yeah.
brings me to a question that Abigail Morin asked. How has the internet smartphone era affected our capacity for quirkiness? Is there more or less room for weirdness, or is it the same as it always was, just in different formats? And I feel like we can riff off of what you were saying about Jennifer Egan and her work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, time is going to move no matter what, and things are going to change no matter what. And so, like, for me, like, one of the things, like, I'll just tell you right now, I talk about like the nostalgia of like living in
Mhm.
that small rural town and not having much, and so making weird stuff to
Mhm.
account for the lack. But I
Mhm.
would have run my parents over with a car if I could have listened to any song that I wanted to listen to
Right.
at the drop of a hat. It would have been the most incredible thing. I do
Right.
not know. And so, as much as I know you lose something by having all this connectivity, and maybe it would be nice to pull back, and I'm still weird in that I still have physical copies of CDs and stuff that I
Yeah.
listen to. Like, I don't have streaming stuff, but still I can still understand that, like, for my children, like, there is something really incredible and beautiful about that kind of connectivity, to
Mhm.
be able to see like all the other people that care about the things that they care about, to have forums devoted to the thing that you love, to be able to see people talk about it without
Mhm.
embarrassment, to simply see some weird movie because someone mentions it. That's all really great. So I think the weirdness is still there, and I think you can still find it. Um, and just like anything, there's always pockets that are unknown.
Right.
But I'm happy with how I grew up.
Yeah.
But I do know, man, there are some moments I wish I had it.
Well, okay, wait. There's one last question because we are, of course, out of time.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's someone called Amanda asking, was there anything too weird? Now is not the time to panic, or other books that had to be cut? And if yes, can you tell us what, or anything you fought to keep in?
Oh man, so that's a great question. No, I think my editor, Helen Otsma Echo, and she knows what she's getting. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
they know, they've read my work. They know I'm gonna try to do something slightly strange, but I always tie it to stuff that feels pretty easy to me. Like, I'm not like aggressive in the weirdness, but there was nothing like it's. I will say, like, there's very little that has to be cut in the stuff that I turn in.
Mhm.
There's just lots that has to be completely rewritten, because like the pathway I thought made a lot of sense doesn't
Right.
to a regular person. So no, things don't really, like, there's never where I'm like, this has got to stay in, because if I say it has to stay in, I'm like, oh, I can't have anything that follows.
Right.
I'm sometimes not aware of the ways to get like this thing to happen. So no, there's nothing that I fight to keep in. I do know, with nothing to see here, the one thing, and why now is not the time to panic is the way that it is with the mom, was my previous editor, and he was absolutely right. But he said, none of the adults and nothing to see here, like, the mom has no redeeming qualities. Would you like to go back into the book
Right.
and maybe give her a little more nuance or a backstory? And I remember I was like, not really. I just don't want to. I just think she's not great. And and he was like, okay, fair enough, and I kind of fought to not add dimension or depth to a character. And then I was like, let's try next time though, from the get-go. But yeah, so what I try to keep in is maybe a lack instead of,
Yeah. Okay.
cutting stuff. Yeah.
All right. And that said, we really have bumped up against time. But more importantly, next time I
Yeah,
see you,
yeah.
we'll talk about Charles Portis and True Grit and Carson McCullers and some other stuff. But, unfortunately, I have to let you get back to the thing that we're not going to talk about, which is the book you're working on before school starts.
Yeah. I will use
So,
any excuse I can to talk to you, Miwa. So thank
well,
you.
right back at you, Kevin. I mean, this is always fun. So I'll just wait patiently for the next book and next time, because every time I see you, I'm like, we have to talk about True Grit, but there's so much other stuff to talk about that, sorry, Charles Portis people. We will get to it eventually. But dude, thank you so much. It's always really good to see you. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us. And if you do want to see this video again, it will be up on BNN's YouTube channel. So, oh boy, here we go. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.